here. So I have Professor Shazia Choudhry with me today, and she's going to talk about her project. It's a really innovative project, and please tell us, Shazia, about how you came to it and what it's about.
Okay, so we came to it. We have at Queen Mary, we have a vice principal who is very interested in engaging with funding bodies and doing research internationally, and set up what's called the Resilient Futures Initiative in India. So it's a particular focus on India, and basically was really good in terms of getting us together across disciplines within the university, but also across different academic institutions in India. So this all started, the ball started rolling with an initiative basically from QM, where we went over to India and we were able to sort of brainstorm ideas with disciplines that crossed over with law. And in my case, it was political science, anthropology, geography, and obviously domestic abuse. So we came up with the idea and got some funding to do a very small pilot project, the results of which we are still considering. We've got some results. And we're able to put in an application to the British Academy as part of its scheme in this area too, in terms of resilience, and looking at how resilience develops in this context.
Right. So are you able to share some of those preliminary results with us? Or
Not really. I mean, so we've just had the draft report, which we've got to actually consider next week. But it's quite interesting. It was about, I'm going to tell you about what we've done so far with the pilot project. So we have 3 states that we were looking at in India: Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Haryana. And the pilot project work, we concentrated, and I should also add that it's across, this is where the geographies come in, it's across urban, semi-urban and rural communities. And what we're looking at is the experience of victims of domestic abuse in India, and really looking, from my perspective, how well the domestic violence legislation has actually been implemented, and you know, where are those gaps, and how are those gaps being bridged by the victims themselves? How are they coping? How are they showing their resilience? So the first pilot project took place in a rural environment, a small village in Tamil Nadu. And what we did was we engaged in qualitative research, so with a range of stakeholders, including survivors, and then very much depending upon the state and what it provides. So, for example, the Domestic Violence Act in India envisages that special protection officers, for example, have to be set up in various areas, but it depends very much where you are. So again, the qualitative research is also with service providers such as they exist in the state. And to that extent, we also had to undertake a mapping exercise to find out what was actually available, because there's very little research in this area, as it turns out. So yes, so that project interviewed so-called support officers, or whatever the particular version was in Tamil Nadu, lawyers as well who were engaged in this work, the police representatives, or whoever that was supposed to be, and survivors, crucially. And we also interviewed people who work in NGOs who are supposed to be supporting domestic abuse victims. And so, yeah, so that's what we've done. We've just looked at it. It's a very small project. I think it was about probably only 10 women that we spoke to, but we still got some very rich analysis. So we wanted to make it intersectional as well, as much as we can. And so there's a fairly broad representation, I think, of caste and religion as well there. And I mean, I think it might be more interesting, Debbie, first, if I just talked about some of the issues that we had actually in India.
Yes, that would be great.
Rather than the thing. So yeah, so even that, it's just come to mind as I was just saying the word caste, which is fairly unproblematic for me to say as a British academic, but that was a real issue for us, particularly with our Indian colleagues, how they were going to ask the question.
Right.
So even in terms of the work, you know, when we have a questionnaire at the beginning, which is just to give us some kind of demographic information about the individual, right. We had to have a real discussion about how do we ask somebody what their caste is. And of course, the two British academics was, well, you know,
just ask it.
You can't just ask it, but you can't just ask it. So we had to kind of find a roundabout way. So from a methodological point of view, it was really interesting. I think they just ended up saying, where would you place yourself, or something like that. And then, of course, there's the linguistic barriers as well, or the linguistic considerations, I should say. So in Tamil Nadu, there's different ways of talking about caste as opposed to Haryana, as opposed to Maharashtra. So it was really, really interesting in that respect. So we've got some intersectionality, I hope, in that very small sample that we have. But yeah, so far, I mean, what I can tell you, and I found this actually quite surprising, was that unlike the UK, I should add, actually when women did go to the police, the specialist police that were where they existed, they were actually quite helpful, which I was not expecting at all. As I say, it's only a very small project, and the lawyers were not helpful at all. Yeah, that's not. I'm not surprised by that. Lots of discussions about kind of, and actually, when the interviews with the lawyers were quite illuminating in terms of their attitudes towards domestic abuse. So the overwhelming view that we seem to be getting from service providers is that the solution lies with the family, and that one should try to get over this issue, domestic abuse, and that very much is coming from lawyers. It's also coming from sometimes medical service providers as well. So the picture that has emerged, I think, is that it's incredibly difficult for women to actually get any help in terms of leaving the relationship. Quite apart from all the other barriers that exist generally for domestic abuse victims in terms of finances, where they're going to go, what they're going to do with the children, etc. There are significant cultural barriers in terms of even the service providers who are supposed to be helping them are actually not in any way entertaining the idea that they could leave the relationship. Now, that might be because they recognise also that it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to do so within that particular context, but it is also about their own kind of cultural norms and values that are therefore being imposed upon victims of domestic abuse.
Can I just follow up a bit on the helpful specialist police? Are they generally women, or are they male, or mix of both?
Well, so in Tamil Nadu, they're quite lucky because there is so what they've tried to set up, not everywhere has them, are women-only police stations.
Right.
And I think one of the service providers that we did speak to was somebody who worked in a women, and they were actually quite sympathetic and they were actually quite good. And I think it's self-selecting to a certain extent, that if you work there, and also I think they have what little training exists has been given to a woman-only police station, because they're obviously serving a particular purpose. So the general view is that they're quite positive actually. So there are women-only police stations, and then this kind of the ordinary run-of-the-mill police stations. And again, once we get this project up and running, it'll be really interesting to compare the experiences of police stations and the general ones across those 3 states.
Right, brilliant. In terms of your future plans then for the project, tell us a bit about what you plan to do next.
Well, what would be great is to be able to do the fieldwork, which unfortunately has had to be postponed because of COVID. So once we get the fieldwork out, and we've done that work, obviously, then we've got to analyse it, look at the findings, and the idea is very much to work on dissemination. And one of the really important aspects of this project for me has been the capacity building element. We're not just working with academic institutions, we're working with 2, but we're also working with 3 NGOs, women-owned organisations that work with victims of domestic abuse. And so the capacity buildings, not just in terms of obviously the research funding that they've received in terms of being able to help us with the field work, but it's also building their capacity to engage in research projects like this in the future as well. So it's also been training their staff in terms of this is what's going to happen next, in terms of coding, analysing, qualitative research, actually conducting the interviews, transcribing, that sort of stuff. So all that I think is really, really important in terms of future projects, not just ours.
Right, that's brilliant. So how long is like the expected duration of this current phase of fieldwork? And
so the total length of the project was 21 months, and it was supposed to start in January. Now, obviously, we've had a bit of a delay, and the British Academy has actually very kindly granted a 1-year unfunded extension to all projects that included empirical research in this particular stream of funding. So we have got a year's extension, which I think we'll have to use. It's really interesting. If worse comes to worse, I mean, some of them obviously will be done online, but it's very, very difficult to do that in rural locations in India, right? So there's that's going to be problematic. So I think we're very much kind of trying to do as much as we can online. We have a contingency plan. We push back the field work until Easter. So let's just wait and see. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Shazia. I think it's not just about the topic, but also the challenges of doing this kind of large-scale project in a different country context,
Yeah.
and the challenges that you face, etc., from it,
Yeah.
which are really, really useful for others to know about. So thanks very much for sharing that with us today.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation.